Okay, so now we are on to the adrenal gland. We'll try and get through this part pretty quickly. Um, you just want to know the difference between the medulla and the cortex. It's all laid out right there on the slide, so I am not going to explain it to you, even though I find it interesting. There we go. So for this chapter, we're mostly going to focus on what comes out of the adrenal cortex, because this is the traditional endocrine tissue that releases but that releases what we traditionally think of as hormones, whereas the medulla is nervous tissue, which, if you ask me, I would say dumps neurotransmitters into the bloodstream where they act like hormones. This is why I'm not big on defining what's a hormone and what's not, because it gets confusing. At any rate, we're going to spend our time talking about aldosterone and cortisol. Those are going to be the two examples of mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoids that we care about. So first up, mineralocorticoids. As a group, there's a whole bunch of them. They regulate your electrolytes because these are minerals: sodium, calcium, potassium, these sorts of things. Aldosterone is the most important and most potent mineralocorticoid. What it does is stimulate your kidneys to reabsorb sodium from the urine. This then leads to water retention, which is going to maintain your blood volume and therefore your blood pressure. And that's primarily what aldosterone's job is to regulate sodium levels so that your water levels or your blood pressure is proper. And then, because the mechanism of sodium reabsorption in the kidneys is our friend the sodium-potassium ATPase, aldosterone is also used to regulate potassium levels. Excuse me. So I want to briefly explain what I'm talking about with the water reabsorption in your kidneys, because we haven't even talked about the kidneys yet. So in your kidneys there are tubes, which we will talk about when we get there. These tubes contain what is going to become urine. However, it is processed as it flows through the tubes, and solutes can be pumped or shuttled back and forth from the urine into the bloodstream, or from the bloodstream into the urine. So if your body's blood pressure is low, aldosterone is going to get released. That is going to cause sodium to be pumped from the urine back into the bloodstream. That then generates two gradients, right? Now you have more sodium here than there was here, but because now you've removed solutes from the urine, there's more water there, or a greater concentration of water. So you've created an osmotic gradient. Whoops. And because water can go wherever it wants to, but sodium is pumped, water is then going to follow the sodium back into the bloodstream. And when you reestablish your osmotic balance, you've now got a greater volume of water in the bloodstream than you would have had otherwise. So it's a way to hold on to water. Sodium is pumped out of the urine and water follows. And that's kind of the general gist to remember: water follows salt. Excuse me. So let me just check my objectives. This, I believe, is one of your open-ended questions. Be able to list the 4 mechanisms that control aldosterone. So this is 4 things that either lead to more or less aldosterone being released from the adrenal cortex. First up, as we mentioned before, is a drop in blood pressure. So if your blood pressure goes down, more aldosterone is released. And that's what you want to be able to say when answering this question: is what causes the change in aldosterone, and is it more or less? Next up then is increased potassium in the bloodstream. So here, if you've got a lot of potassium in the bloodstream and you're going to move potassium into the urine, because this is a sodium-potassium ATPase, sodium gets pumped that way. So this is what aldosterone is affecting, is it's turning on this sodium-potassium pump here and bringing sodium back into the bloodstream and getting rid of potassium. This is one of the reasons why you have to watch your sodium intake, because you can't regulate your sodium and potassium independently of each other. So if you've got excess potassium, your body is going to continue to reabsorb sodium so that your potassium levels are where they're supposed to be, and you're going to end up with elevated sodium levels and hypertension because of all the water that follows it. The third thing that can affect aldosterone release is adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. So if you are under stress, this can cause increase in aldosterone release. This is related to blood pressure, with the idea being that the stress might be physical stress, and when you are under physical strain, you want to hold on to water so that you don't become dehydrated when you're getting through whatever physical stressor you're under. And then the fourth thing that affects aldosterone secretion is high blood pressure. So if your blood pressure goes up, then aldosterone release goes down. So this is the part here that you want to know. So high blood pressure, stress, high potassium levels in the bloodstream all cause more aldosterone. High blood pressure causes less aldosterone. You don't have to worry about atrial natriuretic peptide being the mechanism for it, because that's just too much. But what does happen is your heart recognizes that your blood pressure is high. It releases a hormone called atrial natriuretic peptide, which blocks the release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex, and then more sodium stays in the urine, which means more water follows the sodium into the urine, and you're basically urinating out your high blood pressure. So the interesting thing to note here, is aldosterone regulates sodium levels, but it doesn't respond to sodium levels. So your body regulates sodium to maintain blood pressure, as opposed to just having a sodium concentration that makes your body happy. Alright, next up are the glucocorticoids. We are going to think of them being as primarily concerned with regulating blood sugar levels. The glucocorticoid that we care about is cortisol. You will recall that it is regulated by adrenocorticotropic hormone. So if your hypothalamus senses stress, it will release ACTH, which causes if your hypothalamus senses stress, it will release CRH, which causes the anterior pituitary to release ACTH, which then causes the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. The details are not so much important. What it's doing is freeing up, again, some of your fat stores, and maybe some proteins to make more glucose and increase your blood glucose levels. The effects of cortisol make sense if you think about the course of human history and the factors that have impacted human evolution. So for most of human history, people didn't live very long, Some people did, but for the most part, when you're talking about stress, stress was physical stress. And psychological stress was usually associated with physical stress. Am I going to have enough water? Is there enough food? Are the crops going to come in this year? So stress was really about short-term survival for a couple of weeks or a couple of days. So what cortisol is doing here is increasing your blood glucose levels so that you have energy to get through the stressful period. It is sparing your glycogen stores, because you don't want to run out of glycogen, and going after fats and proteins. So it's tapping some of your emergency energy reserves to give you some energy to deal with whatever physical stress you're under. This is why psychological stress is so hard on people today, because we live longer, and most of our stressors are psychological. Am I going to have enough money to pay rent? Am I going to have enough money to retire? Finals, taxes, pandemics, all of this stuff. So when most of us are under stress, it's not because we don't have enough calories or we're worried about survival, it's other things. So this hormone gets released that breaks down our fats and proteins, increases your glucose levels, and most of us, a lot of us, respond to stress by eating a little bit more. So if you're eating more and you've got cortisol being released because you're under stress, you're going to end up with way too much glucose in your bloodstream, and it actually leads to insulin spikes and the formation of more fat. So if you go through a very stressful period, you do need to watch your diet because your body is not going to respond well to excess calories in times of stress. So get some exercise, best way to deal with stress. Moving right along. You simply want to know that too much cortisol is Cushing's. Don't worry about any of the symptoms. We're just going to know the names. And then too little cortisol is Addison's disease. But we don't really know enough about all of the ins and outs of cortisol to have all of these symptoms make sense to us. Now, gonadocorticoids, you simply want to know that they exist. They're not important. I don't think I would ask any questions about them on the exam, but they are sex hormones that get released from the adrenal cortex. Now we are on to the adrenal medulla, which should be kind of review for us because this was in Anatomy and Physiology 1. This is where your epinephrine and norepinephrine come from. So what you want to know about the adrenal medulla is this versus that. Your short-term stress response versus your long-term stress response. And it's not really the adrenal medulla, but this is sort of the adrenal in a nutshell. So your short-term stress response is just your sympathetic response, which you are familiar with already from Anatomy and Physiology 1, so just know that list of things there. And then your long-term stress response is the effects of cortisol. So retention of sodium, maintaining your blood volume, maintaining your blood pressure, breaking down fats to maintain your blood glucose levels. And it does cause suppression of the immune system. This is not something I understand very well, why cortisol or why stress should depress your immune system. My thinking is that it's an energy conservation tactic where your body's response is conserve energy because you're under some sort of physical stress. Hope that an infection doesn't kill you in the next couple of days, and suppress your immune system so that you have some energy to get through whatever stress you're under. So you're sort of hedging your bets that you're not going to die from an infection while you're dealing with whatever stress you're under. Pineal gland, this we should talk about. This is where melatonin comes from, and that's what you want to know about it, and melatonin helps you fall asleep. And that's all you need to know. Pineal gland, melatonin, helps you fall asleep. Alright, next up is the pancreas, and I'm going to say we don't care about this slide. We will talk about acinar cells versus pancreatic cells when we do the digestive system. For now, we just want to know the two hormones that come out of the pancreas. The first one is glucagon. Glucagon is released in response to low blood glucose levels, and what it is going to do is increase your blood glucose levels. This right here is how, but this bullet point and that bullet point are the main takeaways. Whoops, and here's a figure for glucagon. I forgot that was in there. Then insulin would be its antagonistic partner. So insulin is released in response to high blood glucose levels, and what it is going to do is lower your blood glucose levels. Primarily what it does is just stimulate muscle cells and other cells in your body to insert glucose transporters into their cell membranes. And then because you've got a lot of glucose in your bloodstream, it diffuses through those transporters. So it's just facilitated diffusion, which is a form of passive transport. And that's what you want to know for insulin, and then the figure for insulin. Diabetes, we'll talk about briefly. I tend not to spend too much time talking about medical conditions and pathology, because what we really want to focus on in this class is homeostasis. It is enough work to understand how the body works, and we don't need to heap too much of what happens when it doesn't work on top of that. But diabetes is worth talking about just a little bit. There are two different types of diabetes, and that's what we care about. This slide is more background, which I would not ask you about. First up then, type 1, or what is sometimes called early onset diabetes. This is an autoimmune disease. So your immune system attacks your beta cells. They're the ones that produce the insulin. So your body does not have the ability to make insulin. Type 2 diabetes is sometimes called adult onset diabetes or insulin resistance. This happens when you have a poor diet, lack of exercise, probably some genetic predisposition too, which means you have elevated blood glucose levels for an extended period of time, elevated insulin levels for an extended period of time, and for reasons that I don't understand, when that happens, your body's cells stop making the receptor for insulin. So your body produces it, but it is not detected. And even though you've got high blood sugar, your physiology is behaving as though you have low blood sugar. Then we have just a couple of odds and ends. As this says here, other hormone-producing structures. The heart, we saw already, produces atrial natriuretic peptide. You will recall that blocks the release of aldosterone from your adrenal cortex, allowing you to urinate out more sodium, and then water will follow it, and your blood pressure will go down. The thymus we don't care about, just skip it. Kidneys release EPO. We'll talk about that when we do the kidneys, so don't worry about that one. Leptin is one that we do want to know because it's not going to come up anywhere else, except maybe the reproductive system. It's produced by adipose tissue. It is a hormone, and it's involved, as this says here, in appetite control. When that first came out, and this was maybe 15 years ago, people were hoping that it would be a possible therapeutic intervention point to help people lose weight and regulate their appetite, but I don't think there are any appetite or weight loss drugs out there yet that interact with the leptin system. And then ovaries, testes, and placenta all produce hormones, but we'll talk about them when we do the reproductive system. All right, that's the end in 18 minutes. That was relatively quick. Hope I didn't go too quick, but I just imagine that these screencasts are boring.